As dusk approached in 1944, the war's destiny had experienced a dramatic transformation. Allied forces, resembling unstoppable titans, menaced the Reich's boundaries from both eastern and western battlefronts. Meanwhile, the grand capital Berlin lay in ruins, subjected to relentless enemy bombardment. The residents, weakened by food scarcity and wartime hardships, found little cause to anticipate the approaching holiday celebrations. The dark comedy that previously resonated through Berlin's streets had evolved into bitter humor, captured in a jest making rounds throughout the city during those bleak times. Be sensible, give a casket as a present. 2 years prior, a profound transformation had occurred within the German consciousness just before the 1942 Christmas season. Driven by whispers that General Paulus's Sixth Army was surrounded by the Red Army at the Volga, Nazi leadership battled to accept the approaching destruction of the Wehrmacht's massive formation amid Stalingrad's wreckage and the frozen steppes. Expecting to deliver devastating news, Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda and information minister, proclaimed a Germanic Christmas in 1942, characterized by austerity and steadfast ideological dedication. Candles substituted wreaths, and conventional melodies gave way to performances of Silent Night. By 1944, memories of traditional roasted goose had disappeared into obscurity, replaced by family correspondence about demolished buildings for sons returning from combat. Airstrikes, alternately conducted by the British during nighttime and Americans throughout the day, became so commonplace that Berliners sought comfort in cellars and underground refuges, forsaking their sleeping quarters. Sleep deprivation fostered a mixture of suppressed hysteria and fatalistic acceptance. Fear of Gestapo retribution for defeatist attitudes diminished, evident in the spread of underground humor. The acronym LSR, initially signifying Luftschutzraum, air raid shelter, humorously evolved into Lerne schnell Russisch, learn Russian swiftly. The Zoo Tower, Berlin's enormous flak tower featuring rooftop artillery and extensive shelters, dominated the urban terrain. The prevailing mood predicted an approaching societal and national collapse. Berliners, convinced of their currency's impending worthlessness, engaged in lavish expenditures. Water shortages during air attacks rendered restrooms into unpleasant locations. Authorities sometimes sealed washrooms due to increased suicides within, a harsh indication of the city's anguish. With inadequate shelters for a population of 3 million, foreign laborers marked by letters indicating their origins were forbidden from underground refugees and subway basements. This directive, stemming from Nazi racial theories and the perceived expendability of Eastern workers, intensified the hardships faced by the diverse labor force. Nevertheless, among foreign workers, some enjoyed greater freedom and witnessed changing fortunes as the Red Army progressed. Berliners, however, maintained an ancestral and visceral dread of the Eastern Slavic invader, an apprehension easily converted into hostility. In February 1945, tensions were already strained, and the Reich's citizens remained unaware of what lay ahead. It was a crisp, bitter winter evening in the German city of Dresden when, shortly after 9 p.m., the early warning alarms began their wailing. As customary, inhabitants retreated to their homes' basements or the limited available bunkers for protection. This had become virtually routine, a pattern that numerous German cities had endured since the Second World War's commencement in 1939. However, that February 13th, 1945 evening would prove different. This occasion marked more than merely another assault. Without even suspecting it, Dresden's residents would become casualties of one of the most savage and lethal attacks executed by the Allies, specifically the Royal Air Force and United States Army Air Forces. Dresden's second wave of attacks commenced at 1:23 a.m. Without electrical power, sirens required manual operation. By that hour, the city's conflagration was so intense it remained visible from 100 kilometers away. The smoke plume ascended to 4,600 meters. Firefighting efforts had to cease and extreme temperatures melted glass and metal. At the central station Hauptbahnhof, the brutality surpassed all imagination. Refugees crowded into freight carriages while others packed corridors and tunnels. 2 trains had recently arrived from Königsberg carrying hundreds of children previously evacuated eastward and now being evacuated once more to protect them from the advancing Russian forces. With the initial incendiary bombs, corridors and tunnels filled with smoke. In journalist Philip Knightley's words, the flames consumed all organic matter in their trajectory. In journalist Philip Knightley's account, the flames devoured everything organic in their route. Whatever could combust was incinerated. The following day, American aircraft arrived to strafe survivors attempting to reach the Elbe's banks. The city lacked illumination and water supplies. Without shelters or concrete bunkers, desperate people sought sanctuary in old buildings' basements. For many, what was intended to shield them ultimately crushed them, literally, collapsing upon their heads. Others perished from heat exposure, with oxygen depleting and only carbon monoxide remaining to inhale. The location they had selected for safety had actually transformed into a furnace. Inferno consumed the ancient German city. Streets once teeming with activity became ghostly quarries within merely 20 minutes, echoing with wails, heart-rending screams, delayed detonations, and occasionally the muffled crash of subsequent collapses. One British pilot who took part in Dresden's attack on February 14th's night observed, "Hell, as we Christians envision it, must resemble this." That night transformed me into a pacifist. Then arose the challenge of extracting bodies buried beneath hundreds of kilograms of debris, identifying corpses, and providing proper burial. As weather shifted, the stench became intolerable. The city's cemetery was overwhelmed, and survivors' strength was exhausted. Identifying women proved more complex than men. Their documents were in purses abandoned far from their remains or mixed with other victims' belongings. Eventually, it was decided to enter basements where dozens of bodies still remained and employ flamethrowers to cremate them on site. At that moment, Churchill penned a letter to his senior commanders. "I believe it is essential to concentrate on military targets such as oil facilities and communications directly adjacent to combat zones, rather than executing acts of terror and destruction, however impressive they might appear." The Second World War's final months were transitional periods during which German forces, in desperate resistance, attempted to delay the Soviet offensive's overwhelming superiority, which advanced like an unstoppable steamroller toward the German Reich's eastern territories. On battlefields where war-hardened soldiers' shouts once echoed, now resounded the footsteps of courageous elderly men and children, summoned to defend an exhausted homeland. The futile sacrifices merely fueled discontent among the population, who began sympathizing with the notion of sheltering deserters. A Polish farmer present in Berlin on January 24th witnessed women shouting at officers and non-commissioned officers, leading a column of German soldiers down the street. "Let our husbands return home and send the senior Nazis in their stead." Due to the shortage of men available for the front, preparation of improvised recruitment units had begun the previous autumn. With most German men between 17 and 45 already conscripted, the Volkssturm became a mixture of teenagers and elderly men, forming an improvised final defensive line. Gauleiter and Reich Defense Commissioner in Berlin led an intensive propaganda campaign to boost enthusiasm and loyalty, displaying images of elderly men and young boys marching together in formation and receiving military instruction to defend the National Socialist cause. Soldiers' morale at the front experienced no improvement despite all these initiatives. Many were horrified to learn from letters received from home that their fathers and sometimes even their grandfathers or younger brothers were being trained for combat week after week. In reality, most Germans displayed considerable skepticism, partly due to their proverbial respect for professional specialization. Despite their efforts, the Volkssturm was destined to fail, as its men were not provided with food rations, forcing them to depend on their families for sustenance. Defense commanders soon recognized that World War I veterans were the only ones possessing a certain sense of duty, while most recruits slipped away whenever opportunity arose. Another paramilitary group desperately created at war's end was the Werwolf guerrillas. Himmler relocated to his headquarters in Hohenlochen to receive information about the Werwolf project, accompanied by Prutzmann and other high-ranking SS military officials. Himmler expressed the intention to create and organize a resistance movement in Germany. Nevertheless, according to witnesses from the beginning, Himmler expressed skepticism about the plan's success prospects. War, a voracious consumer of generations, had transformed the army into an amalgamation of those who had witnessed more winters than battles. Among the old warriors whose wrinkles narrated stories of bygone epochs, and the young who barely comprehended a rifle's weight, an echo of resistance emerged. Initially, Werwolf recruits came from the Waffen-SS, the Army, Hitler Youth, the Jaeger, and the Gestapo. But as time progressed, the military crisis deepened, and resource shortage became critical. Recruits became increasingly younger. Many boys ended up sacrificing their lives, often futilely, As the Werewolf Project advanced, various groups and personalities within the Third Reich's monumental bureaucratic apparatus became involved in this initiative, as was typical with all new ventures of the Hitlerian Empire. Almost simultaneously with Kitzmann's werewolves, the Nussknacker Nutcracker Project emerged, led by Arthur Axmann, head of the Hitler Youth. Its purpose was training members over 14 years old in guerrilla warfare tactics. Although the Nussknacker Project was absorbed by Prutzmann's group in January 1945, those young people who did not receive training, either due to lack of time or being under 14 years old, were encouraged to carry out sabotage actions. These improvised recruits, mobilized in a final desperate effort, often found themselves without adequate training and lacking sufficient equipment. At that time, young people matured in a year, a month, or even during a single battle. Unfortunately, many did not survive that first encounter. Determined to prove they could perform superior to veterans, some of whom could be their fathers in age, they displayed reckless bravery that had consequences. The ultimate offensive against Germany was being organized. East Prussian villages, which until recently considered the conflict something remote, now witnessed it approaching them in all its severity. Soviet soldiers had inscribed phrases such as "forward to the fascists' den" or "vengeance and death to the German invaders" on their tank turrets. They met minimal opposition as the T-34s, and Stalin heavy tanks progressed at 2 in the afternoon, the frost coating their armor providing effective concealment in the terrain stretching ahead of them. The Soviet forces advanced through East Prussia, and the terror of atrocities they committed in the initial occupied villages sparked panic throughout the region. The situation for Germany became catastrophic due to the desperate flight of hundreds of thousands of refugees, women, children, and the elderly, under hellish weather conditions. With a winter of sub-zero temperatures, they commenced their exodus, abandoning their ancestral homelands' dwellings in overcrowded trains, marching along snow-blanketed roads or frozen lakes, and under the persistent threat of Russian aviation and armor. Desperate masses attempted to reach Baltic ports. For them, a vessel represented security and an escape passage to freedom, transporting them westward. In this terrestrial exodus toward the Baltic, casualties from cold, starvation, disease, and combat numbered in the hundreds of thousands. By March 4th, Soviet tanks had advanced to the Oder's mouth in Stettin, reaching the Baltic and severing land evacuation routes westward for the nearly 2 million Germans still in Pomerania and the Danzig Bay. Only one escape route to freedom remained: the path across the Baltic Sea. In the war's final weeks, although no clearly defined eastern or western front existed, even in the fragmented warfare with isolated conflict zones, soldiers remained willing to resist for as long as possible. Despite the increasing scarcity of weapons, ammunition, and fuel, small groups continued fighting. Those born in 1926 or later were known as the Flak-Helfer generation, having matured with the Hitler Youth and participated as anti-aircraft assistants in air defense artillery as children. Due to their complete indoctrination under National Socialism, these young soldiers were routinely employed as the final and often fanatical individuals available for sacrifice in defensive battles and last stands. In these wars' closing days, the common sight was 16 or 17-year-olds with rolled sleeves and ill-fitting uniforms, fighting not merely for their nation, but for the only regime they had ever known. The greatest terror among Germans, both soldiers and civilians, was the approaching Red Army. After 3.5 years of an attrition war, or rather an annihilation war, Vernichtungskrieg, against the Soviet Union and specifically its Slavic peoples, the fear of revenge could hardly be deemed groundless. However, Soviet soldiers' violence, primarily directed at German women, was more a reflection of the troops' brutality than a politically motivated action. As soon as it became known that Soviet troops were approaching, the civilian population fled westward en masse. By early March 1945, nearly 8.5 million people had departed Germany's eastern regions. Additionally, approximately 1.5 million internally displaced persons came from western cities that had since fallen into American and British hands. Moreover, nearly 5 million elderly women and children had escaped air raids on their cities by seeking refuge in the surrounding countryside. While the thunder of Soviet artillery and the hum of Allied bomber formations filled most Germans with terror, for others those same sounds were signals of hope. Above all, those imprisoned in concentration camps and other Nazi facilities for forced labor or political prisoners yearned for liberation and ultimately viewed those Allied incursions as a survival opportunity. The predominant desire among Germans at that time, both troops and civilians, was to witness British and American armies advance eastward as rapidly as possible, reaching Berlin and occupying most of the country before the Soviets could surpass the Oder Line. Few were willing to collaborate with Hitler's objective of obstructing through self-destruction. On March 19th, the eve of the Rhine crossing, Hitler issued an order declaring that the battle should be conducted without consideration for our own population. The massive mobilization of men to the front had created a palpable void in cities and towns. Streets once vibrant with life now echoed with unsettling quiet. Women, the elderly, and children witnessed resource depletion and the disorganization prevailing in a society overwhelmed by the conflict's devastating consequences. Food shortage stood as an omnipresent specter, an intangible adversary lurking in every corner. Empty shelves in stores once filled with various products testified to the situation's harshness. Rations became increasingly limited, and the population faced the daily challenge of finding sustenance to survive. Agriculture, torn apart by war's demands, could not satisfy the needs of a starving nation. Administrative disorganization and the lack of logistical resources worsened the crisis. Infrastructure crumbled, communications became chaotic, and bureaucracy descended into anarchy. The governmental apparatus, once efficient, was now overwhelmed by the tragedy's magnitude. Authorities struggled to provide basic services while the population faced a reality where normalcy had completely vanished. The economic collapse manifested in the currency's rapid devaluation. Money, once a symbol of prosperity, lost its value at an alarming pace. Runaway inflation contributed to the widespread feeling that economic stability was a distant memory. People impoverished by circumstances witnessed their savings evaporate instantaneously. Distrust and fear spread like a social contagion. Contradictory information and government censorship generated skepticism among the population. Propaganda, which had once effectively influenced the masses, now faced skepticism and resistance from those seeking truth amid the confusion. By April 1945, virtually all Germans were aware that the military adventure Hitler had initiated in 1939 was about to conclude. The country's disintegration brought with it the virtual absence of news, as newspapers and other media that could have offered insight into what was actually occurring had disappeared. In this vacuum, only war propaganda continued to exert enormous influence over Germans' perception of reality. Hitler's birthday, Friday, April 20th, 1945. A sunny day dawns on Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday. Amid ruined buildings, party flags rise above the rubble proclaiming, "Dient Berlin, Grüß Gott." Although in previous years congratulations flooded the Reich Chancellery, in 1945 few packages and letters arrived, reflecting the city's desolation and resource scarcity. Even at Berlin Zoo, where many animals suffered from starvation, Göring was awakened that morning at Karinhal, his country estate north of Berlin, by the barrage that opened Rokossovsky's offensive. Outside was a convoy of Luftwaffe trucks, which were needed for more urgent tasks, loaded with the plunder he had accumulated. A detachment of motorcyclists would escort him south. The Reich Marshal dedicated a few words to the soldiers and saluted them as they departed. Himmler had returned to the Hohenleuchen sanatorium the previous night, and at midnight he had champagne brought to toast the Führer. Goebbels, the only Nazi leadership member willing to remain with the Führer in Berlin until the bitter end, delivered a birthday speech that morning asking all Germans to blindly believe in their leader, who would ultimately guide them through the hardships. The more cautious housewives began packing their suitcases with essential provisions, anticipating the imminent battle and seeking refuge in basements to survive. Civilian casualties were numerous. Women waiting in line for food formed ranks like Napoleonic infantry, enduring even after a shell explosion decimated the line they occupied. It was said they cleaned blood off their ration cards and continued. "They stand like walls," noted a Berliner in her diary, recalling how they used to rush for shelter in bunkers at the sight of fighter planes in central German skies. Women queued for a ration of butter or sausage, while men ventured out only to get a turn for a shot of schnapps. This contrast symbolized women's immediate concern for survival, while men sought to escape the war's consequences. Germans appeared famished, visibly worn by their suffering. Berlin was not a beautiful city. Its streets were narrow and filled with barricades, broken trams, and other vehicles. Houses were empty because everyone had taken refuge in basements. During the retreat to central Berlin, SS execution squads carried out their grim duties with increasing urgency and insensitivity. Around Kurfürstendamm, they entered houses displaying white flags to shoot anyone they found inside. Horrified by the collapse's momentum, Goebbels described these surrender signs as a pestilential bacillus. However, General Mummert, commander of the Möncheberg Panzer Division, ordered SS squads and the Feldjäger in his sector to surround Anhalter Station and Potsdamer Platz, threatening to execute the executioners on the spot. Conditions gradually worsened for those caught in the fighting. German soldiers rarely found themselves near a water pump, forcing them to quench their thirst, exacerbated by smoke and dust, by drinking from the canals. Cases of nervous breakdown due to the combination of exhaustion and constant artillery fire multiplied. To maintain resistance, Bormann, like Goebbels and Ribbentrop, spread the false rumor of a deal with the Western Allies. Stand firm, fight with fanaticism. He ordered the Gauleiter in the early hours of April 26th. We are not surrendering. We have no intention of capitulating. We are aware of foreign policy's evolution. Hakes, Hitler signed Reich leader Bormann. The lie was soon exposed by Hitler and Goebbels' reaction to Himmler's attempts to seek a truce with the Western powers. In Hamburg on May 1, 1945, Wagner's music played on the radio. The music was abruptly interrupted. A subdued voice announced that significant news would be broadcast in a few minutes. It was 9:30 p.m. The word spread across Germany. In almost every house in the country, people sat motionless, eyes fixed on their radios. By that point, they knew that no news could be good news. More than an hour after the announcement, after Bruckner's music, Admiral Karl Dönitz's voice came on, solemn with sadness and worry evident in every syllable. The past's certainties had vanished. German men and women, soldiers of our armed forces, our Führer Adolf Hitler has fallen. He stated that Hitler had died fighting the enemy without providing many details about the circumstances of his death. He clarified that he had been designated as the successor, insisted on the need to defend against the Bolsheviks, and said the fight would continue. Germans knew this signified the end. What they had imagined, despite the misinformation they lived under, had become reality. The war was about to end, and they would be at their enemy's mercy. Dönitz spared them the truth that Hitler had taken his own life, not wanting to demoralize them further. In Demmin, something terrifying occurred, leading the population to face a horrifying situation. Over 3 days in 1945, Demmin was a small enclave of 15,000 inhabitants, 156 kilometers north of Berlin in what is now western Pomerania. In 3 days, over 10% of its inhabitants had taken their own lives. On the afternoon of April 30th, several white flags flew from public buildings in Demmin and from the steeple of its main church. 3 Soviet negotiators, including a German officer, approached with a promise that the city's inhabitants would not be disturbed and that there would be no looting if Demmin surrendered without a fight. They were killed by Hitler Youth snipers. Rolf Dietrich Schultz, who was 9 years old then, testified many years later that he had seen and heard Gebhard Moldenhauer, a fervent National Socialist and local schoolteacher, telling a neighbor, "I just shot my wife and 3 children. Now I only want to take out some Russians." That evening, after a deceptively calm sunset, the Soviets looted and set fire to the city in a frenzy of violence that lasted through 3 terrible days. They raped almost all the women and shot any Germans who dared protest. 80% of the city was destroyed by flames. The Russians poured gasoline on house walls and stood guard to prevent the fires from being extinguished. There were mass executions, summary shootings, and continuous looting by drunken soldiers who had stormed a couple of distilleries and several liquor stores in Demmin. This feeling of disillusioned despair, resigned desperation, and fascination with death materialized shockingly, influenced by Nazi fanaticism, the certainty of disaster with Soviet troops' arrival, guilt over war crimes and massacres in Nazi extermination camps throughout Europe, creating a sort of collective hysteria. This atmosphere of collective desperation and the psychological impact of imminent defeat created a wave of mass suicides that swept through German communities as Soviet forces advanced. The combination of Nazi indoctrination, fear of retribution, and the complete collapse of the world they had known drove many civilians to choose death over facing the approaching reality. The propaganda machine that had sustained German morale for years finally crumbled under the weight of undeniable military defeat. Citizens who had been told repeatedly about ultimate victory and wonder weapons now faced the stark truth that their leaders had deceived them. The cognitive dissonance between years of propaganda and the harsh reality of defeat proved too much for many to bear. In countless towns and villages across eastern Germany, similar scenes played out as Soviet forces approached. Local Nazi officials, faced with the collapse of everything they had believed in and promoted, often chose suicide rather than face capture or the judgment of their own people. Their families frequently followed them into death, unable to conceive of a future without the Nazi system that had defined their entire adult lives. The infrastructure of daily life continued to disintegrate as the Reich's final days approached. Transportation networks that had once efficiently moved troops and supplies now served primarily to evacuate fleeing civilians. Trains packed beyond capacity carried refugees westward, while those who couldn't secure passage walked along frozen roads, carrying whatever possessions they could manage. Medical facilities, already strained by years of war, became overwhelmed with wounded soldiers and civilians. Hospitals ran out of basic supplies, forcing doctors to perform surgery without anesthesia and treat patients in corridors and basements. The wounded often lay untended for days, their cries adding to the cacophony of suffering that characterized Germany's final collapse. Schools that had once indoctrinated children in Nazi ideology now served as makeshift shelters for refugees or were abandoned entirely. Children who had grown up knowing only Hitler's regime now faced a world where everything they had been taught was crumbling around them. Many had lost fathers at the front and now witnessed their mothers' desperation as they struggled to keep their families alive. The currency system, already weakened by wartime inflation, approached complete collapse. People resorted to bartering goods and services with cigarettes and food, becoming more valuable than money. Black markets flourished as desperate civilians traded family heirlooms for basic necessities. The social order that had maintained German society for generations dissolved under the pressure of total war. Religious institutions, which had been suppressed or co-opted by the Nazi regime, found themselves overwhelmed with people seeking spiritual comfort in their darkest hour. Churches that had remained open became refugees where people prayed for deliverance or simply sought human companionship in their final moments. Clergy who had survived Nazi persecution now ministered to the spiritual needs of a traumatized population. The foreign workers who had been brought to Germany to support the war effort now found themselves in an increasingly precarious position. As German authority collapsed, some saw opportunities for revenge against their former oppressors, while others simply sought to survive until liberation arrived. The complex dynamics between different nationalities of forced laborers added another layer of chaos to the disintegrating social fabric. Cultural institutions that had been pillars of German society for centuries were systematically destroyed, either by Allied bombing or in the chaos of retreat. Libraries, museums, and universities saw their collections looted, burned, or abandoned. The intellectual heritage of generations was lost in a matter of weeks, representing not just the end of the Nazi regime, but the destruction of much that was valuable in German civilization. Communication systems broke down almost entirely in the final weeks. Telephone lines were cut, radio stations went off the air, and newspapers ceased publication. This information vacuum allowed rumors and panic to spread unchecked, often making desperate situations even worse. People had no reliable way to learn what was happening beyond their immediate vicinity, adding to their sense of isolation and despair. Military discipline, which had been a hallmark of the German armed forces, began to break down as the hopelessness of the situation became apparent to even the most dedicated soldiers. Desertions increased dramatically, and some units simply dissolved as soldiers decided to try to make their way home to protect their families rather than continue fighting a clearly lost cause. The Nazi Party apparatus, which had controlled every aspect of German life for 12 years, crumbled with surprising speed once its authority was challenged. Local party officials fled their posts, destroyed documents that might incriminate them, and attempted to blend back into the general population. The elaborate system of informants and enforcers that had maintained Nazi control simply evaporated when it became clear that the regime was finished. As Soviet and Allied forces closed in on the remaining pockets of German resistance, the true extent of Nazi crimes began to be revealed. concentration camps were liberated, revealing horrors that shocked even battle-hardened soldiers. The German civilian population, many of whom had claimed ignorance of these atrocities, now faced the reality of what had been done in their name. The final collapse came not with a dramatic battle, but with a whimper of exhausted resignation. Cities that had once been centers of German culture and industry became ghost towns populated only by the desperate and the dying. The thousand-year Reich that Hitler had promised lasted just 12 years, ending not in glory but in utter devastation and moral bankruptcy. The legacy of those final months would haunt Germany for generations. The collective trauma of total defeat, the guilt over wartime atrocities, and the physical destruction of the country created psychological wounds that would take decades to heal. The Germany that emerged from the ashes of 1945 would be forced to confront not only the practical challenges of reconstruction, but also the moral reckoning with what they had allowed to happen in their name. This period of collapse revealed both the worst and best of human nature. While some chose suicide or revenge, others displayed remarkable resilience and compassion, helping strangers survive and protecting the vulnerable even when they themselves faced mortal danger. These acts of humanity, in the midst of inhumanity, would provide some small foundation for the moral reconstruction that would be as necessary as the physical rebuilding in the years to come. The story of Germany's final collapse serves as a stark reminder of how quickly a complex civilization can disintegrate when its moral foundations are corrupted and its people lose faith in their institutions. The descent from a modern, cultured society to barbarism and chaos took only a few years, demonstrating the fragility of the civilization that we often take.